Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing France, as we have done quite a few times in this show as well. And this time we're going to talk about racism as a whole in France. 6 NGOs, including the likes of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have filed a lawsuit in France, alleging that the government, specifically police, systematically discriminate against Black, Arab, and ethnic minority communities. This then specifically goes to ID checks, which are carried out on the streets as well. That racial profiling, according to these NGOs, is in play when that does occur. Let's put that to our guests now who are joining us from Paris, both of them. We're now joined by Dr. Louis-Georges Tin, who is the president of CRAN, which is the French Black Coalition. He's also the Prime Minister of the State of the African Diaspora. We're also joined by Yasser Louati, who is the head of the Justice and Liberties for All Committee, and he's also the host of the podcast known as Le Breakdown. Yasser and Louis-Georges, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Louis-Georges, let me start with you. What do you make of this lawsuit? Does discrimination occur on the part of French police towards people of color?
Does. That has been proven by many investigations in France. Even authorities, even the court has already condemned the police for such things. So everybody knows about that. The only people who deny the reality are in fact the unions of the police themselves. They say that doesn't happen, that is wrong, that's a lie. So they are totally in denial. But what is interesting here is not only the fact that these organizations are fighting against the French police, but it's a class action. And I'm very glad that my French organization created this the law that makes it possible in France to have class actions. It means that every single citizen, every organization is entitled now to go to court against the French police or against anybody who is creating discrimination. So now it gives more power to the public, to the organization, to the citizens.
Interesting. Yasser, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, of course, we can talk about, the Islamophobia that we've seen over the past year and stuff, but we've also certainly seen, right, racism on the part of police, heavy-handedness towards the Black community and other communities as well.
Well, as you know, history teaches us that the corpus we call the national police or police nationale in France was actually formed under the Vichy government, a fascist government of the 1930s and defeated in the 1940s. The problem is that we see a continuous denial because the religion in France is that the police is necessary and the legitimacy of the police is built on beating down Blacks and Arabs in the banlieue who are perceived as the domestic threat. Now, multiple studies, as Mr. Tin has mentioned, the Ombudsman in 2017 published a report, a scandalous one, that if you are Black and Arab in France, you are 20 times more likely of facing racial profiling by the police. That means 20 times more likely of facing police brutality, if not death at their hands. On top of it, we have successive governments, left-wing, right-wing, and center, with Emmanuel Macron, who have consistently supported the police. So yes, we may have discourses, this is awful, etc. But this is again gives us how racism is viewed in France as a series of isolated events, but not as a systemic problem. When you have in the French police people voting massively for the far right, 52% according to a study in 2018, it shows you that the police not only is a problem in France, but also is a threat to democracy when we see that it can beat down Blacks and Arabs, as we saw, for example, in the videos against the music producer called the N-word on video, but also how the government has jumped to protect the police. And this is the way to go. Because we don't have that many means to apply checks and balances, and the government must be prosecuted. And in 2016, the highest court, the Cassation Court, condemned the government. Yet we still see the French state supporting this police.
George, if this has been happening for so long, and I imagine it has, what does that then mean? What is the relationship then between law enforcement and these communities then? Because, it must make the job of law enforcement themselves very hard, right? I mean, it's in the interest of police to, in fact, have good relations with the communities that they're meant to protect.
Well, what we need to understand is that today, the police is above the law. They don't have to respect the law anymore. There is a high authority which is supposed to condemn the policemen when they fail to do so. Well, they never condemn anybody in the police. For example, once the former Minister of Home Affairs said sometimes there might be racism in the police. Well, he was dismissed and he had to resign. Today, for example, the police unions, they asked the government to vote a law that says now it's impossible to film, to have a video about the police brutality. That law is now being discussed in the parliament. That means that they are taking control of the media. So if you say, oh, I have a video showing police brutality, then you are, in fact, against the law. So it means that the police have taken control of the media. They have taken control also of the justice system. Today, they are saying that they're going to build a system to see how the justice is actually working because they need to control the justice system. Normally, in a real democracy, it's the justice system that has to control the police. Yeah. Today, it's exactly the opposite in France. So it means that this authority, the police, is beyond the law, beyond the minister, beyond the medias, beyond the justice. They are above everybody, above the law, and they are totally out of control. In fact, they are controlling the rest of the country.
Yasser, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think then that this is creating a pressure cooker type of situation, right? Where these communities must be increasingly frustrated with the situation, right? With the way that they're dealt with by not just the judicial system, but also law enforcement?
Well, the police, they harvest what they sow, and exactly because the racial profiling of blacks and Arabs, again, that has been documented, multiple times, does create tensions between communities and the police. As a matter of fact, the police is perceived as an occupying force, and the reason why blacks and Arabs grow up fearing the police and resenting it is because people most of the time do not see the police as a protecting force, but as an intimidating force, be it in the hood, be it in the transportation, be it in school sometimes. And when we saw, for example, on the west side of Paris, in Mont La Jolie, dozens of black and Arab students rounded up, put on their knees with their hands behind their backs. The police was responsible for it, but again, there were no checks and balances to control the police. And in fact, the supervising body of the police, the IGPN, is composed by former police officers. Now, people are asking, yeah, but it's easy to criticize. What are the solutions? Solutions have been proposed for years. For example, to give a receipt anytime you are checked by the police. It was a promise by François Hollande when he was running for president in the mid-2000s, and when he got elected, he dismissed the idea because the police unions pressured him via his prime minister Manuel Valls, and using the excuse that this would create too much paperwork. But the studies conducted in the UK and Spain show that because you control less people, because people have proof they have been controlled, this eases the tensions between the police and communities. But now, speaking of this, we might ask ourselves, maybe the French state wants these tensions to be a thing of it, to happen on a daily basis in order for them to say, see, we need the police because those blacks and Arabs, those banlieues are a threat against the national body, which is, the white France. And that's why, again and again, it cannot be overstated that the police is a problem, not only as an institution, but also in its practices, and to make things worse, in the way they hire. Just one more piece of information, if you allow me. The grades to be hired by the police were to be above 7, a score of 7 out of 20. Today, they lowered the bar to have a score of 5 out of 20. That means, part of my language, they're not hiring the best of the best, they're hiring the worst of the worst.
Interesting. Louis-Georges, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are minorities, right, represented in even Macron's cabinet. There have been, and there have been a few, I know, in previous cabinets as well. Why don't those representatives, those who are able to go up the ranks officially within politics, etc., are they not able to deal with the situation to the benefit of their respective communities?
Well, some of them feel jeopardized. If they had to speak their mind, well, they would lose immediately their position. So they are not really in a position to criticize their own government. And many people are afraid because, of course, the police is very frightening. But so that's why I'm saying it's not anymore a threat against Black and Arab people, and of course against Muslim people. We have a situation with Islamophobia in this country. I am atheist. I don't have any religion, but I suffer for my brothers and sisters who are Muslim as well. But it's a threat for democracy. You know, we had a lot of social movements last year, for example. People were asking for more money because, of course, the situation is very difficult for them. It was even before the COVID crisis. And there was a lot of police brutality. Most of the people were white, but they were poor people asking more revenues. Well, many were destroyed. Some people were killed, and nothing happened, of course. Just to give you another example, one media, a newspaper online called Mediapart, they revealed the existence of two major groups on Facebook made of police people, and all of them speaking bad words against Black and Arab people, racism. Nobody, and that happened a few months ago. Nobody was sanctioned in any way, so they can continue their racist speech. The group still exists, no sanction, nothing. That was a moderate scandal, but these policemen are racist, but what's the problem? They just continue.
All right, we'll have to leave there as a final word, but that was an extremely interesting conversation and very enlightening. We appreciate both Louis, Georges, and Yasser for taking their time out to give us the context, of course, about the relationship between police as well as ethnic minority communities, specifically Black, Arab, and overall ethnic minority communities in France. We've spoken about Islamophobia a number of times. We've spoken about racism as well, but then, you know, on the part of police, when that is done to an extent that it's done in the way our guests described the relationship, and this relationship has been only worsening, you would think that on the face of it, police would want to have good relations with the communities they're policing. But maybe it is, as Yasser there said, that maybe actually this is the official, policy in some ways behind the scenes, the hushed up policy, if I may say, that there should always be tensions between the police and the communities, so that that excuse of always toughening police measures remains then in place, and the government can always say, listen, we need to do more to give police more powers, who then go on to then seemingly abuse their powers in the eyes of these communities. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's warning that the country still very much faces a domestic extremist threat, terror threat, essentially. This especially since that Capitol quote-unquote insurrection, as some people might call it, or others may just call it a riot, that, of course, we remember took place. This all in light of the fact that Donald Trump did lose the election, so that President Biden is now the president of the United States. There's a lot of bitterness of that fact on the part of Trump supporters. And of course, there was and still very much is in many people's minds a doubt about whether or not the elections were completely free and fair, or they were rigged against Donald Trump altogether. If there was voter fraud, all that, of course, comes into the discussion, something that even Donald Trump, mind you, had brought up right before that riot took place at the Capitol. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Michael Desch, who is a Packey J.D. Professor of International Relations. He's also with the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He's a Brian and Janelle Brady Family Director of Notre Dame International Security Center. He is joining us this morning from Notre Dame, Indiana. Michael, good morning to you, and thank you very much for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of this warning? Is it really as bad as it seems? I mean, there's also talk, as you well know, Michael, about putting up a barrier permanently, seemingly, around the Capitol buildings. Is that a bit of an overreaction?
No. I mean, I think on the one hand, it's not surprising, given how flat-footed the U.S. government, and particularly DHS and the Capitol Police, were caught on January 6th, that, they would be now very careful to lean in the other direction of, sort of sounding the warning siren about possible right-wing terrorism. On the other hand, this has been a long-going problem. It's not new. And also, it's pretty clear that the various authorities, whether federal or state authorities, have these groups under pretty extensive observation and in some cases penetration. So I think it's not something that the United States government should ignore or dismiss. But on the other hand, I don't think it's an indication that there's another riot that's imminent.
Can Michael, for a moment, reflect on how exactly we've gotten to this point? I mean, yes, domestic terrorism / extremism has always been an issue, but it has gotten worse in these ensuing years. Am I right to say that?
I'm not sure I would say that. I mean, the Oklahoma City bombing, was probably the most dramatic manifestation of right-wing terrorism in the United States, and that took place in the mid-1990s. And as terrible as the loss of life was at the Capitol on January 6th, it was far less than the human cost of the Oklahoma City bombing. And also the evidence is that it was far less coordinated. Now, the Oklahoma City bombing was undertaken by one guy working with a small group of people, whereas what we saw on January 6th was basically a riot with a lot of different groups, maybe some of which intended exactly what happened, but most of which I think were just along for the ride.
But then era of, Trumpism, if I may use that term, Michael, I wonder, what do you think the days ahead, months, even years ahead, hold? Because Donald Trump has said he's not going anywhere. He's still going to be very much politically active. And I would think that then brings along with it the fact that he likes to be in the spotlight, right? So the way he would likely do that is by saying things and doing things and encouraging things, which may very well not turn out to be very peaceful at all times. And we can go back to Charlottesville and other such times as well, right, where his reactions to those respective incidents weren't in keeping with the office of the president, of course, also. Is that going to be a long-term problem in some ways?
Well, I think there are two elements of it. There is the element of Trumpism, and then there's also the element of right-wing extremism. And the point I was trying to make previously was right-wing extremism has well preceded Donald Trump, and it's likely to be the case that it'll continue to be a problem, now that he's out of office. You're right to say that the two currents came together, on a couple of dramatic occasions during the Trump administration. But, I don't see them, always continuing to be, operating, sort of hand in glove. I mean, the fact of the matter is that some of these groups were quite unhappy that the former president now, did not stand by them, when they thought that he was sending them up to the Capitol to, stage this riot. So I would not overstate that. And also, I think, the whole question of what role, if any, former President Trump plays in American politics in the Republican Party is still very much up for grabs. And there are a lot of people in the Republican Party, especially the establishment wing, who at this point have had enough of the former president. So I think he's probably going to remain an influential figure. And as you say, he certainly likes to be in the center of things. But I wouldn't overstate, how central he'll be, particularly, I think, because a lot of Republicans will have regarded his 4 years in office as something of a disappointment, not only because of the January 6th events, but also the response to the COVID pandemic and things like that.
All right, Michael, we'll have to leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate you taking your time out this morning to share your expert insight with us about this topic. That was Michael Desch speaking to us this morning from Notre, Indiana, sharing his opinions about the U.S. Department of Homeland Security warning that domestic extremism will very much still be an issue, or possibly is an issue, in fact, I should say correctly, in the coming weeks, months, for the short-term future. What does that mean? I mean, of course, this is all in the context, as I said in my introduction, as well as we discussed there with Michael, also in the context of the Capitol riots that took place, or insurrection, as some may call it. But yes, there is this then idea that we shouldn't be overstating things, as Michael there correctly, of course, contextualized. Nevertheless, it's also, yes, a fact that it's not just the person of Donald Trump who has brought forth a right-wing extremism in the United States, and that can probably go for any of these handful of leaders around the world as well, because it's not like right-wing extremism is limited to the U.S., but it still then creates this perfect marriage, right, where Donald Trump wants the spotlight, and possibly again, right-wing extremism may be his ticket to that. Again, there is, I don't want to overstate that connection either, but it may very well be a problem going ahead for Americans in the near future. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss U.S. President Joe Biden, who has signed executive actions, and he's signed, of course, many. And I know there's a huge debate about that as well in the U.S., about whether or not that's a good thing. But nevertheless, one of the executive actions that he did sign soon after coming into office addresses racial inequity in the U.S. He's signed actions that order the U.S. Justice Department, for example, in part to halt its use of private prisons. I know there are some details within that which are also being discussed and debated. He's spoken about a boost of anti-discrimination enforcement in housing, another to underscore the federal government's commitment to Native American tribal sovereignty, and also then to condemn anti-Asian bias, especially, again, in the context of the global coronavirus pandemic. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, because one wonders, are executive actions going to solve racial inequities in the United States in and of themselves? We're now joined by Dr. Johnny Eric Williams, who is a professor of sociology at Trinity College. He's joining us this morning from Hartford, Connecticut. Joining us from Brooklyn, New York is Dr. Oscar Odom III, who is a retired NYPD detective and criminal justice professor at ASA College. And joining us from Boone, North Carolina is Dr. Cameron Lippard, who is a professor and chair of sociology at Appalachian State University. Cameron, Oscar, and Johnny, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Cameron, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of just the overall idea of Biden being able to sign and make things better for race, vis-a-vis race inequality, or inequity, I should say? Can this sort of thing be signed into existence?
Very bluntly, no, it can't be signed into existence, the end of kind of structural racism here in the United States. These are just steps, the first chiseling away of structural racism through the administration. Really, it's about rolling back a lot of the rhetoric and racist policy that was passed during the last 4 years of the Trump administration. So it's important to understand here, these are just the first steps into the quagmire that really is the racial reckoning that we need to have here in the United States.
Oscar, what are your thoughts on that? Because yes, of course, I mean, under Donald Trump, we had some race issues, but it's not like these are new issues. I mean, these have existed for a very long time.
What my colleague just said. And, we look at the Constitution where it says we the people, of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish equality. When we look at these things, this is a first step in order to do this. And I think hopefully later on legislation will come to back up these different policies and the different things that he's trying to accomplish, because we need a first step with it to roll back a lot of things and to get things back on track, so to speak, and to give some of the stuff the intent of the framers of the United States Constitution. So I think it's an excellent step in moving forward, and the executive orders are something that is needed right away to kind of put a stop.
Right. And then, Johnny, what are your thoughts on this in the sense that when we're talking about private prisons as well, and I know there's some debate about that overall and how that's especially affected the African-American community?
Well, I like to start off with, for your viewers,
Sure.
with just a definition from a sociological perspective of what we're talking about. That is, we're talking about systemic white racism, or what's conventionally known as white supremacy, or structural racism, and that is a social system. It's a belief system. It's also a practice system, and it's closely tied with capitalism itself in the United States, right? So both are conjoined. So what you see with the Biden administration, as you saw with the Obama administration before it is really not going to change the kind of structural character of this kind of systemic process, right? It's not going to change that at all. What they're doing is that they're actually feigning that they're doing something, but in actuality, they're not doing much at all. Let me give an example. The prison reform that he laid out, that he's not going to do private prisons. Well, the private prison corporations weren't doing that anyway. They were already moving away from that into other areas, right? So it's really a question about obfuscating, from my perspective, that people are calling for the abolition of prison. That's what people want. But what they're doing is basically cosmetic work with these orders and not changing anything at all. The prisons will continue to exist and put people in jail.
On that point, Cameron, I know that as I'm sure you're well aware, there is a huge conversation about private prisons, right, and how much of an effect this executive action will actually have, because I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that in the U.S. it's at state levels, right, where a lot of those contracts are signed with these respective private companies to run those prisons. Is this just sort of just like, a PR move in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a kind of a PR stunt, just like we saw with other presidents in the past, but it's good that we see a president who is looking towards some way to reconcile some racial injustice. Private prisons are probably not the only thing we need to worry about. Really, we need to go back to the question of the criminal justice system altogether, looking at police brutality, particularly since that has been the call really since the civil rights movement, and even before that, where police have been in control of being the state's arm and enforcing kind of racial injustice to some extent. So, I think private prisons is a place to start, but I agree with Dr. Williams that this is, that was something that was already in place and already kind of started to where private industry really didn't see prisons as a very viable, profitable industry. So, what we're going to see now is more push, I hope, from the Biden administration to look at police brutality, because police brutality, as he described with the recent executive orders, this isn't just about cost to non-whites, it's a cost to the American population, right? And police brutality costs Americans across the board in money, expenses, and as well as in the injustice, right? The amount of work it'll take to unravel that injustice. So maybe it'll bring in the white American public to think about the economic cost of racial injustice, which I really like what Biden did there in that spin.
Awesome. You have certainly expertise in criminal justice overall. What are your thoughts about what's been spoken of vis-a-vis, the need to reform the criminal justice system, private prisons, et cetera?
The criminal justice system needs to be reformed. There's no doubt that there is systemic racism within inside the system. Undergrad, I did correction administration, and in corrections, it's a great thing to get rid of the private prison industry because, first of all, there was no rehabilitation really taking place in there. It was profitable. I visited numerous prisons across the country and found no rehabilitation to take place whatsoever. So basically, it was demeaning, it was degrading, and hopefully that will drive down the numbers. When you compare to a place like the Netherlands, where there's basically any prisons, I think in 2017 or 2018, they had 19 prisoners total over there. So we have to reflect and look at what we're doing. The policing, one of the things that, being a retired law enforcement officer and academic, I look at it from a scholar practitioner approach. Police officers or law enforcement are public servants. They follow orders of the mayor or the governor of the state. So a lot of times the different policies that are there within inside of the police department are coming from the political arena. They're telling them what to do. They're giving them certain types of equipment, and they're basically following orders. If they tell them not to do certain things, then they will not do it because they don't have to give them the resources, and they could just say no. But a lot of times, people look at it as a us versus them mentality, and they need to look at it and also change the racism and the systemic racism that is taking place within inside law enforcement and what they're being ordered to do. I'll give you an example. New York City, with approximately 40,000 police officers, if you tell 40,000 police officers to go out there and write 25 summonses each, you got 40,000 police officers doing this, which is harming the public and causing a lot of.
All right, so then, Johnny, if we can, let's move on to housing as well, because I know that that's been a huge issue as well for the African-American community, and I imagine possibly other communities as well in the U.S., where there's been discrimination in within that sphere. Also, I know there's also talk of gentrification of certain neighborhoods as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, basically, when you look at Democrats and Republicans, the existing administration, I think you should keep your viewers focused on the system itself. This system is designed not to remedy the problem, but to put a Band-Aid on the problem. All presidents are not going to create this kind of radical kind of change unless there is tremendous push from the bottom up, from the people. That's the only way it's going to change. So this housing discrimination thing, again, I mean, we can go back to what Dr. Lippard was saying and Dr. Odom's right. It's that these are initial good first steps, but basically they stop there. From my perspective, right? They don't go forward. So the housing discrimination will still be there in the banking of giving loans out to people, right? Who will get the loan and who will not get the loan? They will continue to be redlined. This has been going on, I mean, for decades, if not a century, when it comes to home loans. And where people reside, real estate steering is going on across the country, left and right. And so we have these neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, Latino, Asian, and then predominantly white institutions, white places where they're gentrified. It is primarily white and there's no other color, except for, there is a green thing that people like money. And so if you have money, you can go into a neighborhood no matter what color you are. But because of racism, there's a disproportionate number of people who don't have the money to move into upscale housing and so forth. So there's no affordable housing, really. It's all driven by the market in the United States. This is what Biden was trying to address, but it's not doing enough. That's what I would say.
Cameron, what are your thoughts on housing? I know that I was just in the U.S. recently, and even myself, I did notice that there were parts of I was in Houston, but there are parts of Houston as well which seem like they're very cut off from other parts, and seems like a lot of they're little small bubbles, if I may call them that, instead of communities living side by side, literally. Is that the case in many places in the U.S., and then how serious an issue is that then, that sort of discrimination as well that we may very well see playing out?
Yes, I mean, sociologists and other social scientists have been documenting segregation in residential areas across the nation for, really decades or even a century. And the problem is that we're not looking at the issue of hypersegregation, right? The hypersegregation is what we face today. We're actually more segregated than we were in the 1960s and 70s, especially with the idea of, you can buy your way into a particular neighborhood. Well, that comes with a cost. And we know that there's structural racist issues that get in the way of many non-white families being able to even purchase in those better communities, or even to integrate into those better communities where we see better schools, we see better services. So segregation is still a real thing here in the United States. It's always been kind of in the background of our racist society. We have to remember that every institution in the U.S. has to be dealt with when it comes to structural racism. And, what we see usually, though, when we try to deal with these things is really a backlash. And what many of our scholars are now calling white lash, or we got that term from CNN Van Jones, white lash, right? That we have white American society pushing back when we do these things. So I agree with Dr. Williams that, this is just a start, and it may fall flat on its face because housing is an issue for everyone, regardless of race, and it's hard to convince white America that it's a significant issue for non-whites. And that's always been the problem. of convincing white America, who represents the political majority and the numerical majority, to feel like this is a worthy cause, right? And see this as a need for everyone. So that'll be interesting to see if we can convince white America to step up and see this as something that we all have to deal with. And I think what we're seeing right now is really whitelash or backlash to those ideas.
Yeah. Oscar, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but, housing really also affects education too, right? Because if you're living in a good neighborhood, you have access to better schools as well. All of that plays out then into this, what we may call segregation, or just, these bubbles, if I may call them that as well, where these communities are separated from another.
Yes, and once again, it shows you how it plays out in so many different ways. If you remember, there was a state where a lady was incarcerated because she had her daughter go to use an address in another neighborhood so that her daughter could go to a good school, and they incarcerated her because she used another address so her daughter could go to a great school. When you look at what Dr. Martin Luther King said, what is the most segregated day of the week, which is Sunday, which is where people go for houses of worship. And it shows you, once again, people normally go to houses of worship in their particular neighborhoods in which they live in. So it shows you once again how it's segregated. And then once again, when you see that, it shows you what happens when it comes time for school and education. Because when people want to go to good schools, if it's not in their neighborhood, some people are willing to get a different address so that they could go to that good school. However, this is the 21st century, and we still have this segregation that is taking place. If you look at the 60s and 70s in different states in New York City in particular, when people were looking for, if you were receiving government assistance, they came to inspect your house. And when they came to inspect your house, they would go in your closets to see how much clothes you have, how much food you have in your refrigerator, how much food you have in your cabinet, to establish whether or not you were really making the amount of money in order to live there. So it goes way back and it continues.
Johnny, I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. What needs to happen, in your opinion, for this first good step to be followed by a good second step? I mean, what's the next logical step here, do you think?
There needs to be a reckoning with the United States' role, not only domestically, but internationally around the world in facilitating oppression for profit. These things are all driven by the mechanism of the Constitution of the United States, which is a document designed to facilitate commerce, or in vernacular terms, business. That's what they want to do. They want to make a profit. So the Constitution is designed to do that. Everything from the international scene all the way down domestically is along those lines. For instance, the police, when it comes to housing, that is gentrification, what they normally do is, and as well working with the banking system and the local politicians, the police are sent in basically to rough up a neighborhood as it deteriorates, to get people to move out. The bankers come in and buy the property and then sell it, they clear it, build new housing at a higher price and sell it to people who have the money to buy it. Right. This is the way it works in the United States. So what needs to happen is a reckoning with the system itself, and to radically transform the system in a radical transformation of values too, alongside that. That's the only way we can resolve this. This Band-Aid stuff is not going to help us at all. We're going to go into movement after movement, revolution, uprising after uprising until this is addressed.
Very well. We'll leave it there. We sincerely appreciate all three of our guests, Johnny, Oscar, and Cameron, for taking their time out of their, no doubt, busy schedules to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there President Biden signing those executive actions with the aim of addressing racial inequity in the U.S. Will he succeed through these executive actions to do that? As all of our guests there did agree, on the face of it, this is a very good first step. So no one's arguing that point. But what then happens really on the ground? What will be the real world changes, as we may say, for many of these ethnic minority communities, especially the African American community, but not just that. We also have the Native American tribal sovereignty issue, as well as the anti-Asian bias because of the pandemic. So we will keep a very close eye on this, because this has been a very long-standing issue too. It's not like this happened, the racial inequity became worse, for example, just under Donald Trump. It's been unequal and an unequal society for a very long time when it comes to those regards, be it segregation of housing, schools, all of the above. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.